In the US, you are, as I understand it, often congressmen and women or senators, they're often facing as much opposition from their own side as they are from the other side. They've got a freedom to vote how they choose. In Australia, if you're elected to Parliament, particularly on the Labor side, it's actually within the Labor constitution that if you cross the floor and vote against your party rather than staying in solidarity, you get kicked out of the party. Now, that's the theory of it. I haven't seen too many examples of that in practice, but the point is that there's a real rigid discipline there. So you can essentially take for granted the Conservative numbers on one side, the Labor numbers on the other, and yes, to then form government, they need to work with the Greens, the Independents.
Yeah, and there's much more independence in the American political system in that each representative in Congress can do essentially whatever they want to, and the party has to sort of convince every person to vote for a bill.
Yes.
There's always a Joe Manchin who's a spoiler of some kind, which I think is actually, it sounds like it's more democratic, and maybe it is more democratic, but I hate it, and I'm much more of a fan of parliamentary democracies where the party wins, the party does what it wants. If people don't like it, you turf the party out. But in some ways, it's more authoritarian in a parliamentary democracy for the duration of the government being in power, because you're able to actually do stuff.
I'm on the fence about it. I see your point. I worry about the American system where individual not MPs, but individual members are beholden to special interest groups, donations, and all the rest of it. I can see, and it becomes like herding cats if you don't have party discipline. On the flip side, though, the problem with the Australian system is there's such rigid discipline that some MPs are great. The MPs that are trying to become ministers, because that's another difference. They work their way up to Prime Minister from within the parliamentary process. But others are just sock puppets. You could literally put a trained monkey in there, and all they've got to do is know which side of the chamber to sit on for the vote.
Yeah.
And half of America always opts out, right? They don't bother to even vote, whatever their thoughts. Whereas in Australia, we have compulsory voting. That's something that Americans just can't get their head around.
Yeah.
But people are forced out to the ballot to vote. They can,
mind you, we make it easy to vote. Like in the States, it is arduous.
It's almost impossible in some places, isn't it? It's unbelievable.
I wouldn't say impossible, but go out and stand in line for 3 hours in the snow on a Tuesday, whereas here
we do it on a Saturday.
We properly fund, the Electoral Commission.
A truly independent commission.
Yeah, so that the boundaries are drawn without gerrymandering, and then it's run nationally instead of on a state-based level, and you don't have to. I've never waited more than about 3 minutes to vote.
And you get yourself a sausage sizzle while you're waiting.
Yeah, that's right. We have sausages. It's so Aussie.
But look, I accept your point. It's definitely worse in terms of tribalism in the US than it is in Australia. But
what's your central point about the decline of tribalism? You think that people had a stronger party voters had a stronger party affiliation a generation ago?
Yes, whereas now I think it's issue-based. So certainly in Australia, in Australia now, the academic research in Australia at least is that there is what they call a de-alignment of voters, which is to suggest that there's a greater chunk of swinging voters versus
as
party
evidenced
aligned.
in the fact that the big parties' votes are going down and down.
Yeah.
And also because we don't have a presidential system, I guess there is another option without wasting your vote. You can feel like we have a preferential voting system, so you can vote for whoever you want, and it's not like voting for Ralph Nader where your vote ends up going to waste.
And because we have compulsory voting, it drives both of our political parties, the major parties, to the centre.
Right.
So, look, there's always examples where they don't do this in their own electoral interest to some extent, and we can talk about that. But for the most part, at least come the campaign, the Conservatives try to appear a bit more centrist by and large, and the Labor Party don't want to be pulled to the left by the left-wing ideologues in their party. They want to go to the centre, and that's because we have compulsory voting. There's at least half the electorate that rock up who really don't care about politics, and they really don't have a natural view of one side versus the other. If they're working class, they're more likely to lean Labor than Conservative, but there's been a bit of a shift even in that in recent decades. So they turn up and they vote. So the major parties want those swathe of voters who really tend to sit it out in the US in a non-compulsory system. They want to win them over, and to do that, they have to cobble their way to the centre. And that's one of the reasons. There's lots of others, as you say, we don't have a presidential system, but that's one of the reasons why it's infinitely less likely in a country like Australia that you're going to end up with a Donald Trump type figure.
Yeah, I mean, for many reasons. I mean, the downside of the American political system is you can end up with a Donald Trump, and the upside from my perspective is that you can end up with a Barack Obama, who also wouldn't have come through the Australian system, remotely as quickly as he did there, because in America you can appeal directly to. I mean, primaries are the other thing here that we should mention when we're talking about the forces that push parties and policies to the centre in parliamentary democracies that don't exist in America, which is that in the States you've got primaries, which again is one of those things that, much like the independence of members of Congress, sounds more democratic, and perhaps may be, but is also a deranging force, just like the independence of congressional members is as well, in the sense that here, there is no small cohort of extremely committed radicals on each side who decide who the candidates are, as there are in the United States, where you've got the only people who are going to vote, in a presidential primary in Iowa in the middle of winter and go out to some school town hall to sit around with a bunch of their neighbours and discuss the pros and cons of Nikki Haley are the most committed Republicans, right? So you end up with the red meat Republican, aka Donald Trump. He wouldn't get through the party process because he would alienate all of his colleagues, who are the ones who would have to vote him into power in a country like Australia. And
it's a good point that you make. Another way of saying it is when you sort of have that Barack Obama Donald Trump comparison. In Australia, you are, in a good way, less likely to get the sort of the crazy politician, the real outlier who appeals to the so-called base, but it's more of an extreme end. But you are also less likely in the compulsory voting system of Australia to get the inspirational leader, or the leader who is going to be prepared to do some radical change, not just because it's populist, but because it might be needed. And that's because they become much more risk averse. They've got their talking points in Australia because they don't want to. The Australian system encourages you to not make mistakes, as opposed to encouraging you to go for it and become charismatically appealing.
Oh, that's interesting.
And there's good and bad in that.
Yeah, that's right. We end up getting the least unliked person as the Prime Minister, rather than the most.
That's sort of how preferential voting works. If you think about it, the idea that in Australia you don't...
And just explain preferential voting.
So you don't... If you've got 6 candidates, you rank them 1 through 6.
Americans sometimes call it rank choice voting. Well, yeah.
And basically you distribute preferences until one candidate has 50% plus one of the vote. So it could well be that your first person doesn't get up, but your preferences for your second, third, and even fourth might get distributed. And eventually when one candidate gets to 50 plus 1, they win. And because we're a major party system, usually that's when all the preferences of the minors are getting distributed. Eventually you've got the Labor Party and you've got the Conservatives, and eventually it becomes a lesser of evils pick. And that goes to this idea of the least disliked. In Australia, you're not really electing who you want. You are putting deliberately on the ballot paper the ones that you dislike the most in your last position, to try to guarantee that you don't get them.
Which is a phenomenon that we're seeing more and more all over the world, in the sense that negative partisanship is becoming really salient. Like, people are, in the US election later this year, it's really going to come down to whether or not a few tens of thousands of soccer mums in 3 or 4 states decide that they just hate Donald Trump so much that they're going to show up and vote for Joe Biden. I mean, that really is the function. Nobody's coming out to go, yeah, Joe Biden is just the man we need for the job, right? It's going to, if he wins, it'll only be because of negative partisanship towards Donald Trump.